Everybody, my name is Mary and I'm a Boston Public School mom. I am here with my daughter, who you might hear, and I am giving this presentation about defunding public education through charter schools. And the reason why I'm giving this presentation is because I'm an education activist and I have been talking to families and friends about the way charter schools affect the BPS budget and the fact that charter schools are actually a mechanism with which the legislature pays less money per pupil without parents realizing what's happening. So it's a way that the legislature actually defunds public education in urban schools. But it's very complicated how it happens. It's, I believe, intentionally complicated so people don't realize what's happening. And saying the legislature is acting like a gangster. If you think about money laundering is a mechanism used to hide the fact that you've made money. This is actually sort of like money laundering, but it's the opposite. It's a way that the legislature hides the fact that they're actually taking money away. So how does this work? What's the basic mechanism of this? And before I go through this, you might listen to this presentation and say, well, wait a minute. The funding for a public school for the district is way more complicated than this. And granted, it is way more complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. However, this is absolutely a factor. It's absolutely a factor that is affecting the budget of public schools. So this is how it works in a very simplistic, simplistic terms. Say you have 3 students and their names are April, Bonnie, and Carl. They are non-special education students. They are non-ELL students. They're just regular general ed students, and right now they all are all in kindergarten in Boston Public Schools. So what happens is when the state legislature sets the budget at the beginning of the year, they say, okay, BPS, for April, Bonnie, and Carl, we're going to give you $11,000 for these 3 students. So here's $33,000. Knock yourself out. Go teach them reading, writing, math, and everything's great. Everything's equitable. Now, what happens if Carl decides he wants to go to a charter school? Now, there's many ways the state law could have set this up. They could have had charters act as their own district so that the money comes directly from the state so that it gets funded just like any other district. That actually would have made a lot of sense, but that's not what they do. What's important is the state legislature still funnels the money through BPS. So, and they call it tuition, which I think can be confusing because people think of tuition as like you go to college and get tuition. But the state legislature, they call it tuition, and they give the tuition money for April and Bonnie. They give it to BPS. BPS sends it on to the district. They also give the tuition money and they give it to Boston, and Boston sends it on to the charter school. Now, in theory, this shouldn't be a problem. In theory, the state legislature should give the full tuition to Boston. Boston takes it and sends it on. Now, they may now have an empty seat. However, they have one less kid to educate. So on paper, this isn't a problem. But this is where the magic happens. This is where you have the card trick and the sleight of hand where the state actually ends up sending less money to the school district. So what happens is that the state does not pay BPS all the money that it has to for Carl. Carl, while they would have paid $11,000 for him if he had stayed in BPS, they actually now pay less. And how this happens in the aggregate, and this is actually in millions of dollars, this is the fiscal year 13 budget, BPS actually had to pay $90 million tuition, like I said, they call it tuition for charter schools. What they received from the state was only a $22 million reimbursement. What that means is they then lost $66 million, well, almost $67 million. They subsidized out of their own general education fund $67 million. Now, this is actually pretty significant. If you're a Boston Public School parent like I am, you may know that we're going through some horrendous budget cuts right now. I know that at my own small school, we're losing a couple special education teachers. We're losing a social worker. So this isn't, this isn't something that just happens on paper. The state does not fund, this is an unfunded mandate. The state does not pay the schools for the charter school students. And in the end, BPS actually has budget problems. And like I said, it's very complicated, a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things happening at the federal and state level, but this is one thing that is happening. So to kind of take our three students back to April, Bonnie, and Carl, so how does this actually play out? The legislature then gives to BPS, they give April $11,000. They give BPS $11,000 for Bonnie, and what they give Carl, they give her BPS $7,000 for Carl. So they're actually paying less money to BPS for the same number of students. So where does that money come from? Well, it comes from Bonnie and April. Bonnie and April are now subsidizing the tuition payment to Carl because that money has to come from somewhere. And what it comes from is out of the General Education Fund. So now BPS is now spending less money on their own students so that Carl can go to the charter school. Now, I understand this isn't something that charter school parents, think about. It's not their problem. I mean, it's their job to find the best education, the best school for their child. However, it is a problem for public school parents. So if you try to talk to politicians about this, one thing that they'll say is, oh, it's about choice. Parents want choice. First of all, wrong. Parents do not want choice. What parents want are good public schools. But even if you take them at their word that what parents want are choice, think about what kind of choice this is. Now, if April, Bonnie, and Carl were sisters and brother, and their mom said, okay, I'm going to give you guys all money to go to McDonald's, and she gives them each money to go, $5 each. But then she says, but you know what? If one of you decides you want to go to Burger King, I'm not going to give you $5, but instead, the other two are going to have to give you $2.50 so you can go to Burger King. So that now, say it's Carl again. Carl goes to Burger King. He has $5. Well, now April and Bonnie are left with $2.50. They can no longer get their Happy Meal, but everybody has choice. So you see, it's not actually about choice. It's actually about defunding the public schools. So some other objections that I get when I try to talk to people about this, they'll say, well, what about other funding sources? Again, BPS is complicated. And yes, like parents, we have bake sales and we go, begging for money. We do all sorts of things, but that doesn't take away from the underlying fact that we are subsidizing the education of a minority of the students, because the vast majority of students in BPS in Massachusetts are going to public school. It's only a small percentage that are going to charter schools. Another thing they'll say is like, oh, it's time to get creative. I mean, sure, you can get creative with money. But again, I keep on going back to the fact that it doesn't erase the fact that this is wrong and this is unfair. Another thing that people ask is, can the legislature do this? Yes, they can do this. An intriguing question I've been asked is this actually legal? And, I'm a lawyer. I don't know. I don't know if it's legal or not. And if it's not legal, I don't know what you do. I don't know if you can have a class action suit against a legislative body for not funding things like they're supposed to. But anyway, so it's an interesting question. Now, I want to show you this map. This is a map of charter schools because I want to go back to the legislature and the legislature's role in this. And what I want you to notice is these little red dots, these little red pins, these are all charter schools. And what I want you to notice is they are heavily concentrated in Boston. And there's some in Everett, there's some in Revere. But you start going west, there's none in Lexington, there's none in Newton, there's none in Needham, there's none in Weston, there's none in Wellesley. The reason why I'm pointing this out is because there is absolutely positively no incentive for legislatures, for state representatives from other parts of the state to fund charter schools, to fund the tuition for charter schools. In fact, they have the opposite incentive because with charter schools, the state gets to pay less money altogether for the same number of students And it's not their schools that are being defunded. It's our schools. Now, every year, well, I should say every year that I've been paying attention to this, Sonia Chang-Diaz, who is the state rep from JP, she's my state rep, she files an amendment asking the state legislature to fully reimburse the charter school tuition. It always gets voted down. It's just every year. Every year she does it, every year it gets voted down. Because like I said, there's really no incentive. There's no incentive for someone in Wellesley. There's not a single charter school in Wellesley. So, I mean, what does the state rep in Wellesley care about what's happening in Boston? This is Carlos Henriquez. And the reason why I have him on my slide is because of all the state officials I've ever talked to, he is the only one who's acknowledged that really the state should change the way charter schools are funded. Unfortunately, he's in jail. That's what happens when you live in Boston. Occasionally your elected officials go to jail. And sometimes they're very good, but they still end up in jail. Now, the last thing I want to point out about this is that this is not sustainable. And what I mean is that, say, Bonnie and Carl decide to go to charter schools. April's not going to have a really hard time. You can only siphon money off so much before the school collapses within itself, and the BPS sort of enters into a death spiral. And what I mean by a death spiral is that once the schools start being defunded, and once the parents start seeing that the schools aren't being supported, they leave, and then they start exiting. And some of them may go to charter schools, but some of them may go to the suburbs. In the end, you can't have endless charter school expansion without going into a situation where you eventually just break BPS. So when people talk about not raising the charter cap, it's not because they're against choice. What they are against is having the public schools completely bankrupt. And I think that's a really important point. It's not, it's not some issue of charter schools in and of themselves. It's an understanding of the fact that they're an unfunded mandate that the state is not being responsible for. I mean, the state will always vote to open up more charter schools. However, they never vote to fund them.